Good afternoon. My name is Torrey Carter-Kneed, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer for the American Society of Landscape Architects. Welcome to our next session. I'd like to introduce our panelists to get us started. I'm sorry, I'm the panelist. I'm the host. Let me introduce you to our panelists. Excuse me, it's been a long day already. I'm going to start with Susan Uthaya Kumar. Please welcome her to the stage. She is the Chief Energy and Sustainability Officer at Prologis. Gina Bokra, Chief Sustainability Officer of the New York City Department of Buildings. Joe Rosa, Chief Sustainability Officer of Ryan Companies. And finally, my friend Peter Templeton, President and Chief Executive of U.S. Green Building Council. All right, so let's jump right into the conversation. So just to frame the discussion a little bit, Architecture 2030, a US-based organization, tells us that the built environment generates 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions annually. When we look more closely at the 40%, we see that building operations are responsible for about 27%. This relates to the energy building usage. And emissions from building materials and construction, which we often call embodied carbon, are responsible for another 13% every year. So today, we are joined by built environment leaders who are working hard to reduce the climate impacts of buildings, infrastructure, and landscapes. I include infrastructure and landscapes because we all know the built environment is more than just buildings. We need to start thinking about whole projects or whole sites instead of whole buildings when we discuss climate solutions for the built environment. That said, panelists, all of us are focused on decarbonizing the built environment, everyone on this panel. What needs to happen to move faster on operational emissions? What do you see as the #1 obstacle of electrifying buildings? Peter, let's start with you.
So thank you, first of all, for having me here with illustrious colleagues who are helping champion the cause across the country and around the world. So for us, in terms of the work that we're trying to do, it's really about how we scale solutions. And so looking at where it is that we have the opportunities to take proven solutions across the building industry and apply them at scale across all sectors and all regions. And so when you're looking at challenges like electrification, those are very unique in many different settings because of utility constraints and because of the ways buildings have been constructed over time. So the focus for us is really how we identify what the solutions are that will be applicable in those different settings and how we drive towards the specific outcomes that we're trying to achieve. That really means trying to get every building to be electric ready or to apply to a greener grid over time. In many cases, that does look at getting everyone into a plan that helps them determine at what time they can phase out equipment or make changes that are going to help them address the needs of the building as a whole, to your point, over the course of a near-term solution. That takes many different forms, and I don't know if we want to go into the specifics of what that is in terms of moving to heat pumps and all of the different strategies that we would take, but each and every one of them counts. But it starts with getting everyone on a plan, putting that into actions, and then focusing on the outcomes you're trying to achieve.
Yes, Joe, I saw you nodding your head. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. I think, for the built environment, what I always tell everybody is you really have to understand what the specific deal structure and building type is. So we always say, right, for now, we're all looking for transformative change and net zero buildings. But for now, we need to be committed to a process and leading the teams through the process. So setting the project level sustainability goals is essential. Finding out what the equity partners and debt partners and the folks that are involved with the deal, what they're willing to support in terms of maybe basis point discounts on money and things like that. So we're trying to set the goals. We have a full compendium of all the best practices you could ever want. Bring those into the fold, look at the ROI around that. And when we look at ROI, we look at not only the financial ROI, which is what everybody is dialed in on, but we're also looking at risk as the second big bucket for ROI. So we're looking at climate resilience, water resilience, policy, built for the future, those kind of things. And depending on the asset, how important it is to the occupants, the future tenants of the building, and what's their willingness to support that through maybe a lease rate and things like that. So we have to look at all of that. We have to look at it in a very fast, agile way in order to be able to sort of put the best options on the table, because we're going to do this probably 5% a year. You know what I mean? And in 10 years, we'll be, hopefully in a much better position where we are. But we're not trying to leapfrog over all that change management. We've got to really create systemic change within the sector.
So I probably bring a slightly different perspective to this group because I am a regulator And we're approaching innovation through policy and the regulatory environment, which starts out with a basis in robust energy codes. And we are implementing a building performance standard in New York City, which is one of the first in the US. Now there are about 40 jurisdictions across the United States that are looking at this. So the building performance standard starts to shift that responsibility only from new construction and those projects that are actively seeking a permit to the many more existing buildings that are not doing anything. So this obligates an owner in New York City of buildings over 25,000 square feet to reduce their carbon beginning next year, puts them on a pathway to carbon neutrality by 2050. Along the way, the limits for carbon drop very much precipitously in 2030, and that's tied to very steep fines. The balance of that we also need is this incentive package to motivate owners to make these changes happen in their buildings. And the exciting part of it is the statistics that you shared show us our built environment is responsible for a lot of our carbon. It's also very true that most existing buildings waste 20 to 30% of their energy every day. So we have a huge economic opportunity here. This creates a lot of jobs. It improves public health. It's really a win-win, but we do have to make it possible for owners to comply. So we need to see a lot more investment in robust codes and enforcement of those codes. And I hope that we can set the pace in New York City, provide the lessons learned, and help other jurisdictions implement these kinds of policies.
Fantastic. Susan?
Well, so Prologis has 1.2 billion square feet of real estate worldwide, so that's a lot of buildings to decarbonize. And when I think about what do we need, it's three aspects. So today, based on the energy needs, let's say your electricity needs is X. Tomorrow, with fleet electrification, it's going to go to 10 times. So I worry about the access to power, right? Like, how can you power all of these? And then not just powering it, but how do you green that power? And in terms of greening that power, the obstacle is really alignment of interest. So I love Local 97, which you just referenced. And because what it does is it brings stakeholders to move in a direction. So I love the fact that we have IRA, which incentivizes businesses and the supply chain to think towards a renewable future. I love the policy side, which says, you know what, you must do it. And then on the customer side, it's having the discussion. So when we build buildings, it's occupied by many different customers. The sophisticated customers are all on their sustainability journey. They say, we want to get to net zero. So they're moving with us. But the others who may not have access to the same know-how or the resources, there's a collaboration and an education process. So we kind of think about it in these elements.
Fantastic. You mentioned a couple of things that sort of segue to my next set of questions for you, which is talking a little bit about, I want to talk about embodied carbon, which often doesn't get as much attention as emissions from building use, right? So I'm going to start with you, Gina, so you get a little time to think about it. But it's a question for all of you. And what is needed to reduce the embodied carbon in buildings, infrastructure, and in landscapes?
Well, I think there's a statistic out there that says about 50% of new construction, that embodied carbon tends to come from two materials, concrete and steel. And so we take our cue there and work with those first, and then try and trickle down through the typical materials, pervasive materials that have a lot of embodied carbon, and we attack those and try and reduce the carbon that's in those. This isn't something that has made its way into model codes yet, but there's a lot of discussion about it, so I think it's coming, and it will probably be in those two materials first.
Absolutely. Susan?
Yeah, so embodied carbon is something that, so today you don't have zero carbon or low carbon scalable cement or steel. So we know that that's a challenge. But I think what it's going to require is we're going to have to get there. Now, how do we get there? I think it's through innovation and through collaboration. So what we do is we work with the likes of, large manufacturers on both cement and steel to see what can we absorb, because it's the cost to build, and then how can you use economies of scale or collaboration with other builders to get to a point where it is doable. That is happening right now. So we're experimenting with timber, Nexi panels, building integrated PVs, anything that can remove the quantity of cement being used. We are using, with hydrogen technology, would the production of cement and steel be greener? Yes, it would, but it hasn't gotten to that commercialization stage. So I think we should all do as much experimentation as possible to identify the solution. And once we identify, we should just collaborate and then scale it up. That's my approach.
Yes, and I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up question, and then I'd love for Peter and Joe to jump in. So what are some of the incentives, right, that we can use or implement to get all of these integrated groups to sort of turbocharge their efforts? Yeah.
So one incentive would be, so the efficiency focus of New York, for example. So if there would be so that's in the operation of a building. If we had, I think you were speaking to on when you build, how do you, that's definitely a game changer. Incentives related, similar to an IRA, but focused on material would be a game changer. And then, the thing that I really think would make a difference is if people are spending more capital to build sustainable buildings, the differentiation in terms of a green premium, I think would definitely move the needle.
I can just add that I think the evolution that's happening around the concept of whole life carbon is really important, so that we are looking holistically at the carbon impacts associated with any project in any location, and that we have the understanding of all of the forms at which those emissions are coming from, and so that we're not just focused on the operational endpoints, but really what we can do throughout the process, including the materials that we use, also the construction processes, et cetera, that all present opportunities for us to reduce our impacts. The piece that's, I think, really exciting about this is that the body of knowledge and understanding, I think, is accelerating quite quickly in terms of how it is that you actually know the embodied carbon. That information is becoming more readily available, and the incentives that exist within the IRA and elsewhere are focused on grants to manufacturers to do environmental product declarations, so that information becomes more front and center. You can make informed decisions about what the impacts are going to be of the materials that are selected. And also the conversation that I think is happening among building owners and building designers and material suppliers right now is taking the shape that everyone is focused on this outcome.
I'll add a couple of thoughts. One really tactical and one more strategic. We are looking at, first of all, with concrete. First of all, you have to do a full screen concrete, steel, understand what the big embodied carbon materials are for your particular enterprise. And for us, it changes. Industrial buildings has one profile. A multifamily structure would have a different material priority profile. So we're looking at that. But we are talking to the manufacturers of the concretes. But one of the things we want to do is we want to just tell people, because there's a lot of people out here in this audience, we care about sustainability, but the market is a little bit different. So one of the things we're doing very tactically is we're just telling you, by the way, this is your building, and by the way, this is the embodied carbon of the building. This is the operational carbon of the building. These are about 15 things you can do to lower that with the various ROI principles around that. So we're doing a few things there. We're giving them an informed piece of information so that they could make a strategic decision. But we're also trying to just increase the transparency that there is a carbon footprint and that it's your carbon footprint and there are things you can do. So, and if we can, so that's one big thing we're doing is more tactical. The other thing that we're doing is in our bid forms all over the country, we're just collecting the data. We have 5 different concrete mixes, so we're putting it out there. We're saying, bid the project as it's spec'd, but give us the price and the availability of these different sustainable mixes. We want to start creating a mosaic of understanding what is the regional availability, what is the pricing around these more sustainable mixes, so we can start to give them scale. The more strategic piece, and it's nascent right now, is, and there was a conversation earlier about pre-competitive, or so working pre-competitively with our peers. So we've got peer groups set up with the CSOs of other construction companies. We're sitting down and we're starting to talk to each other and say, can we write a letter? And we need to get Prologis on the table here. But can we write a letter that says to CEMEX saying, hey, these 15 brands represent about $40 billion a year of concrete procurement or whatever it is. Is that enough of an incentive to kind of accelerate the infrastructure across the country and you can see where the market availability and the pricing combine with that collective action to try to accelerate the transition to, say, lower carbon concrete. So.
Please.
Another shift that we desperately need to see happen, and I know this has been a conversation, Peter, you've been involved in for a while. The market needs to change how we value buildings. The valuation of these features being better right now doesn't move the needle. We need to educate those assessors. We need to educate the lenders so that they understand these concepts and that they place an appropriate value on them.
That's such a
Excellent
great
point.
point.
It
You
really
know,
is.
but I have to, if in order to incentivize businesses and to build differently going forward, that's a critical element of it, because we are future-proofing our assets when we invest in them, right? And this is exactly that what we're doing. And when we declared our net zero ambition, we actually started to build differently. So there are, energy-ready roofs, which are much more costlier. It's EV infrastructure that is wired in. So yeah, it's a great point.
Mm-hmm. So in New York City, as we reach out to these owners who have very high risk, high carbon footprints in these buildings, we're also trying to reach out to who their lender is.
I think the sector, we need to do something to help the capital markets world a little bit. When you talk to them, and we're trying to get bluntly basis point discounts. So we're going to give you a return, a financial return on your investment, and we're going to give you quantified sustainability performance. It's a blended return that we want to give you for a building. But we need a basis point discount on that. But there's no clear path, or right now, no real clear standard that says you went from X to Y, because they're all looking for some kind of third-party standard that would work across sectors that they can go to and say it's, because they're afraid of greenwashing claims in their investment portfolio. So there's a big risk for them too. So I think structurally, we just need something that says, okay, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good, but let's get a good standard out there that everybody can says, this building is now 10% better, 50% better, and we can correlate basis point discounts on the money with that. So.
And Joe and I have talked about this. There are lots of examples of where that's happening currently in the market, but there are proxies for what that is. And so LEED is used as that framework in many settings, and it provides access to preferential lending rates in different contexts. But we need to make sure that the outcomes are actually delivering on those expectations, because they're using it basically as a mechanism to avoid risk. And that is, all of the sustainability or sustainable finance conversation is really around access to capital and avoidance of risk. And there's a significant amount of transition risk that is becoming known, but how that's being quantified and recognized by different players in that pipeline is something that is still very much evolving. And so that's why all of us that are in the business of setting third-party standards and doing verification are very much trying to say, we want to make sure that we're hitting the right marks on those right points that actually are going to resonate more broadly across the entire lending sector.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and the ones we are seeing are LEED-driven. The few ones that we are seeing, but they're modest basis point discounts. Yeah, very modest.
So sort of staying on topic, this one's for you, Peter, I want to talk about sites a little bit. Because landscape architects are using tools, climate positive design, other tools to measure, pursuing certifications like Sustainable Sites Initiative, to not only reduce emissions, but also ramp up carbon sequestration, right? They do this by planting trees. We had a conversation earlier about how hot it's going to be in DC and heat island effect and so forth, right? So in your areas, how do you see the main opportunities to sequester more carbon through landscapes and buildings? This one's for you to start.
Yes. So I'm thrilled that you brought this up, because sites is near and dear to my heart. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, the Sustainable Sites Initiative is a partnership between ASLA and USGBC and the US Botanic Garden and the Wildfire Center at the University of Texas, Austin, to come together and look at what does best practice look like in the context of constructed sites. And so over the years, we've been looking at how it is that we can create the most beneficial environments in terms of their reduction of carbon, as well as the human health benefits, et cetera, that come from these environments. And this is one of the opportunities that I think gets missed in too many ways. We take for granted the opportunities that exist in our community for us to actually invest in green infrastructure and improvements that are going to look, even just public rights of way, parks, other areas, as well as every building site that we're working with, to be an opportunity for us to address carbon sequestration opportunities and other beneficial contributions towards the decarbonization initiative.
Yeah, we like green infrastructure a lot, and we're trying to, yeah, it's a huge part of, we see like on the really high end of the spectrum, we feel that the flat work at the site really needs to leverage green infrastructure for the water quality improvements, the biodiversity, natural capital benefits, and doing that with innovative urban designs that create, that extend the value and the experience of the property out into those spaces. We're trying to converge around, okay, we want tenants, and we have, and I think I would encourage everybody in the room to go back and look at your book of business and say how many of your clients and your B2B partners have net zero carbon or heavy carbon commitments. You're going to realize it's a very big fraction of your business. You may not have that fully diagnosed yet. So, and they want more sustainable space. We have to create that, not only just the numbers, the experience, the tenant experience, so they can feel that. So looking at how do you create an immersive tenant experience flowing between the interior and the exterior spaces. And so if you can do that, it becomes part of their culture. They really value that in addition to the quantified performance. And I think the market value of the asset's a little more future-proof, and it's a little bit more conducive to premium rents, which give you higher NOIs, which contribute to the market value of the asset over time. So
we take a little bit of a different approach. So we say, carbon sequestration definitely is a technology that we are piloting and validating, but again, we haven't been able to do it at scale. We build about 40 million square feet per year, so whatever we do, it has to have scale. So what we do is we have a goal, which is publicly stated, which is that we will be carbon neutral in all our construction by 2025. And how we do it is obviously we are buying high quality offset to do so. It costs, and we deploy those costs back to the developing team, so they are incentivized to have innovation in how they build, in the materials that they use, so that it comes from the ground up in terms of how do you reduce your embodied carbon to the extent possible.
So I'll mention kind of tertiary connection that in the Climate Mobilization Act, in which Local Law 97 was passed, which was our carbon bill. We also have a really robust green roofs policy for New York City, which any new roof constructed in New York City as of 2019 either has to have solar panels on it, which everybody makes that decarbonization connection like that, or it has to be a green roof, and that connection gets lost. They don't see it. However, in New York City, with stormwater runoff, it is a huge energy demand for New York City, and there isn't a tremendous carbon connection there. So promoting green infrastructure, whether it is on the roof, like we're requiring in New York City, or if it's happening on the ground, has that urban heat island impact, has that stormwater impact, which then translates to carbon reduction at your water treatment plant. And so it's an important part of our strategy as well. And we are getting all kinds of questions about carbon sequestration, about offsets, about all of these other tools for flexibility for owners, and we hear a lot about how important it is that we maintain the co-benefits of what we're doing in New York City. So we're wrestling with that and talking to other cities, because the flexibility is important. We have to get there. We have to be successful with this policy in New York City. So there probably will be some role for sequestration. There probably is some role for offsets and things like RECs. But we're really most excited about what happens on the building site.
You're sounding a lot like a landscape architect, Gina, I have to say. But you teed up my next question, which was sort of, can you talk a little bit about the co-benefits of decarbonization, right? You started to go down that path, and I'd love to hear what the rest of the panel thinks as well.
So in terms of I think you mentioned it earlier, so it is a challenge that we're facing as we look at decarbonization. It's also a great opportunity, right? So the way we think about it is, so we always come from the perspective of efficiency first. How do you reduce what you use? Therefore, we have businesses that do LED lighting, for example, energy efficiency. Then after we think about efficiency, we go to how do you switch from brown to green, because that helps decarbonize. We are the second largest on-site solar generation in the United States, because that we can generate the energy that gets used by our customers, and we can generate energy that's used by communities that need it or the grid that needs it, right? In the end, lots of, obviously we're a logistics company, so lots of trucks come in and out. We're really, we have our offers in terms of how do we electrify and provide the charging infrastructure for those fleets. So we think of it as we've got something to solve for. How do we solve that with economics and in a business perspective? And that's what we're doing. Yep. Right.
So I love this question, and mostly because there's so many benefits. We could have a whole program on
another session.
Yes, for sure. But I think it's also important for us to look at the different elements that comprise the carbon emissions that we're trying to address. So we focus a lot on energy directly, and that is, of course, where we have a lot of the issues that we're trying to address and the immediate co-benefits that often benefit folks on site and more directly. But there's so many ripples that extend out. When we're looking at reducing the use of fossil fuel energy, we also have the ability to improve the lives of others who may be very far removed from our building sites and have the abilities to have greater community benefits that we want to make sure are matriculating across the entire industry, the entire country. So I think that's where I want us to make sure that we're understanding that reducing energy, reducing water use, yeah, there are cost savings that come with that. There are environmental quality improvements that come from that, but there's also these far-reaching extended benefits by reducing materials extraction, disposal, all of these other components that come with the approach that we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean, we know that the sector is very correctly, completely focused on decarbonization. It's a big deal, but we're really trying to have a very balanced approach at Ryan. So we look at climate protection, water stewardship, sustainable materials, biodiversity, natural capital. We're looking at all of that. And we do a lot of industrial development, and a lot of those companies are not only net zero carbon companies, they're also water neutral companies. They have, you've heard the word replenishment coming up here with some of the other panelists. So we're working to not only decarbonize those buildings, but how can we start turnkeying water neutral buildings? So that does start with lowering the water footprint of the building, but so as our construction team is working with the construction team on the client side, the sustainability team engages the sustainability team on the client side. And it's early stages, but we're starting to sketch up projects in the community where we're doing big developments, but we're also working with conservation organizations and the local utilities and NGOs in the area to create a community impact project that creates that compensatory balance that would also have climate mitigation benefits, natural capital biodiversity benefits, community social benefits, and if it's done correctly, it can connect into workforce development for the social economic benefits. So, we're trying to think more holistically, and we're trying to connect what the clients are asking for from a building standpoint to what the clients are trying to achieve from a sustainability standpoint. We think that we can turnkey that to them with a building that hits on all of those markers. Anyways, so co-benefits, we don't really call it that. We just call it, we got to be attentive to all of these issues.
Speaking of all the issues, so the next question for you, and then we'll open up to the audience here. But of course, decarbonization is important, but I also want to talk about equity, right? And so the Biden administration is focused on increasingly a huge investment in underserved communities in the IRA. But how do we make sure that all of these efforts that you are discussing, all these innovative, really interesting, forward-moving ideas around decarbonization, sequestration, et cetera, how do we make sure that all communities benefit from this work, right? Because we know the history of this, right? Yes. So tell me about how we do that. Talk about equity. Whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, so we touch so many communities, and we really have to think about this. And so when we do things like community solar, it's to bring clean energy to those that are most impacted that don't have access to it at a discount to what you would get from your grid price, for example. We think about, we have a concept called park life. So how do you bring green spaces to communities that can enjoy it for everyday life, Ultimately, what we want to accomplish is that we want communities to want us to be in there. And so you have to pay it back, and you have to make a difference. And the energy transition issue that we have globally, which is the climate challenge, it is a global problem, right? So there's no way to say, hey, those of us that have access to it, we keep using more, but those that don't have it can't have it. So I just kind of think of access to energy as a clean energy and things as a basic human right that we all have to foster And we think about that in the business decisions that we make.
Absolutely. I was recently in New York City visiting with landscape architects who work at city parks. And they have a commitment to sort of, build and create parks in underserved communities in the 5 boroughs. That's one of the sort of initiatives that they've been charged with. So tell me a little bit about what's going on in New York City.
So with our decarbonization policy, there are some different pathways for affordable housing, which is a big challenge for us. The policy applies to about 50,000 buildings across the city of New York. We have 1.1 million. So we're talking about we need to decarbonize about 130 buildings a week until 2050. They have the toughest path forward of anybody. And so we have a different pathway for them to hopefully provide time to get those incentives flowing into the affordable housing market, to make sure that we're seeing this kind of decarbonization activity happen in disadvantaged neighborhoods, not just in the center of Manhattan. And really trying to make sure that we're lifting up those building owners in those communities. So providing free building operator training for those under-resourced owners, helping them with direct assistance, which is an important part of our program. We have an accelerator that provides free technical assistance, connection to financing, connection to service providers, and helps them with incentives. And so the focus of that program early on was those disadvantaged neighborhoods.
That's fantastic. Joe and Peter?
Yeah, I'll be brief. Obviously, it's a big part of their supplier sustainability. So there's a cascading effect under your question is really where we're building buildings. But there's a social equity component to the supply chains that bring the materials to the site. For me, I like to quote, and I think it was Van Jones. He was a CNN guy for a while. I don't know what he's doing now, but he said, we need to do equal protection and equal access to the underserved communities. They need equal protection from climate change and equal access to the mitigation and the benefits that come from that. So as we're launching our community sustainability programs, a lot of the equity is going to be on the water resilience side, helping them be more adaptive and more resilient to the changes that climate is bringing. And so the water cycle, and that is a much, to me, a more direct and effective platform for investing in community impact. It's helping them be more resilient to climate change, and you can use water as a platform to do that. And the things that you do are helping with conservation areas and parks and things like that that provide a benefit, but also an environmental benefit, but a social benefit. And those things need to be directed into the communities that are most at risk.
That need them most, yep.
Yeah. Just quickly, I'll certainly echo things that Joe had said, but I also want us to put this in the context of the global circumstances, that the work that we're doing in 180 countries is really trying to bring the good benefits of green building to all. And we know, we look at a global perspective, the amount of growth that's going to happen in communities where traditionally there hasn't been significant investment. We want to make sure that the proven solutions that we have in hand now are being deployed, so we leapfrog over the issues that we have created in other circumstances around the globe, and then we're taking those benefits and bringing them into communities at scale. And so I'm excited about the opportunities, the learning that's happening, and also the direct economic and job creation and all that comes from investing in this approach.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anyone in the audience have a question? Oh, a couple hands. We'll start with you and the middle.
Thank you, great panel. Don Edu with Climeworks Direct Air Capture. I have a question around Local Law 97, which is incredibly ambitious. And one of the things that I live in Durham, North Carolina, and one of the challenges we have is that some of the local laws that we pass in Durham have been preempted by the state. So my question is, do you think that we can achieve these carbon reduction goals without the Local Law 97s of the world?
That's a great question. And I unfortunately come from a position where the city and the state are lockstep. Makes it a little bit easier for us. And we're looking at our counterparts around the US and watching a lot of legislation that's getting in the way. So I'm not sure I have a great solution for you. I think we need to see local jurisdictions mobilize to the extent that they can. And if they can't, then they have to lobby the state to make sure that it happens. But I am astounded that we started our journey 4 years ago, and there were only 2 other cities that were doing this in the US. There was one other city internationally, and now it's 40. And that includes whole states that are doing this. And if we hadn't passed our law, New York State was just weeks behind us. So I'm optimistic, and I'm still hopeful that we're going to be able to prove that this is a workable solution and that we can do this together with owners and across the economy, not just in the building sector. And hopefully that'll be enough.
Almost every one of you have talked about the range of things between Justice 40 and community access and the ability of communities to be involved. And given that the federal government's about to spend, $800 billion or something in that neighborhood, wouldn't it make sense for some reasonable portion of that money to go to create a community scaling and planning process that could operate across an entire state and that could be then done across 50 states so that you had reasonable participation? I mean, we use the term collective action. Why isn't some of that money going into actually create a systematic way for the communities to participate? It could be provided to Black, Brown, and tribal communities first. They could be given the first opportunity to contribute and add value to the system.
Maybe I'll just address one thing. I mean, if you look at the makeup of the IRA, for example, if there is incentive for companies to provide clean energy in these communities where it's needed. So there is an incentive that you have to know that it's there and you have to know to leverage it. But I think there are efforts being made to put the capital to where there's some of the needs are. I'm seeing it.
I'll just add that from our understanding, there's $1 billion in the IRA plan from DOE for the implementation of codes and building performance standards across the United States. And if you compare that to the amount of money that was under the ERA funding, which was like $7 million for all 50 states to enjoy and share with each other, it's a huge improvement. So DOE has been coming to us and going to our counterparts in other locations saying, how do we spend this so that we make this progress happen?
Yeah, I would add one detail, David. I don't know. I get a little bit less excited about big government programs because they just don't seem to move fast enough. And there are existing tax laws that allow philanthropic impact, investing in communities that are tax deductions for corporations. And we're having, early stage, but I've done this a lot in the past. We're having the speed with which the private sector can organize around these things, stack a few $1 million in a location to achieve the sustainable balance that we need for a particular development or developments in a region. We can move a lot faster, working with NGO conservation partners already operational in the area that know what the state's trying to accomplish, what the local issues are. And so, it's not an or statement I'm saying, it's an and. I think what you're suggesting is good, but we can still take action right now, and that's what we're trying to do. And we're getting, some millions are getting stacked to get it done. So there's interest in doing that.
I'm just going to say I agree wholeheartedly, and no one's waiting. So we're excited by some of the progressive moves that's been happening on the regulatory front, and glad to see that there is actually collaboration and comparison that's happening from city to city and community to community. But none of us should sit back and wait to take action. That I think we all have an obligation to do so.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. I'm Christina. I think it's really exciting that there are policies that incentivize the decarbonization of each building, but how do you model and make sure that the entire built system works together and not fragmented?
So the built system meaning a building, or you mean like a building connected into
the entire site?
Like a community urban design sense that it's not just one, each Lego piece, but a working environment.
So there's a lot of accounting that is happening at each scale. So it starts at the asset component, and I think that that's one where I'm really excited that there's been a lot of momentum about having accountability around that with some clarity around how we actually go about that successfully and consistently. A lot of our focus right now is on this topic about how that scales and that you're able to look at that at the portfolio scale, whether that's a citywide portfolio, whether that's a corporate portfolio, whether that's an investor-held portfolio. And so you can start aggregating that data, but it starts with having reliable components to it. I think the point that you're making is one that is very much where we're headed, is being able to say that the city has made this much progress towards its climate goals collectively in its built environment work. And so we're all looking for input on creating the best solution to do so.
Our project sustainability planning process, and you'll like this answer, I think, is we have the building, then we have the site, and then we have the community. So we look at it through those three lenses separately. And so we're looking at the risks, climate risks, water-related and stress risks, and anything we know about the social fabric and socioeconomic fabric of the area. So depending on what the sustainability goals are for that particular client, for that particular building, we're inside doing efficiency things. If they want, we can make recommendations at the site level. But for the more sophisticated, progressive clients that really want net zero energy or water neutral buildings, we have to tie that into the community and the watersheds. And the number one guiding principle is local relevance. So do you have a project development process for that impact investing that is going to lead you through the discovery to understand what is going to be the most meaningful for that local community? Not what you think it needs, but what do they think they want,
Fantastic. Any closing comments from either of you? If not,
I would say, I was just thinking about it, the climate challenge is a global problem. So literally, it's not for the haves and the have-not. I mean, it's a global problem. You can't just solve a part of it. You just have to solve all of it.
Right, a holistic approach with many co-benefits.
There's no borders, there's no emission borders.
I wish more people, I think
There's
we
no
still have
mission
more work
borders,
to
that's
do
right.
to get people to
That's a
understand.
quote for the conference.
Right, right. Anything in closing? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to be with you all.